Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith is day 256. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 87 and 88 of the Tertia Pars, that is, of the remission of venial sin, and of the return of sins which have been taken away by penance. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10, and so here we go. Article 1, whether venial sin can be forgiven without penance. First of all, what do we mean by venial sin? St. Thomas will write a couple articles from now. Venial sin is the inordinate inclination of the affections to some temporal thing. Or as we said in our last episode, it is an inordinate turning towards some mutable good, but not to the extent that one turn away from God for its sake, which would make a sin deadly or mortal. Then for venial sin to be forgiven, one must, at the very least, as St. Thomas says, have a certain virtual displeasure, so that, for instance, a man's affections so tend to God and divine things that whatever might happen to him to hamper that tendency would be displeasing to him and would grieve him were he to commit it, even though he were not to think of it actually. This kind of pervading displeasure of absolutely anything that might oppose one's trajectory towards God in the heart, union with God, coupled with a counteract of charity or an infusion of grace, as we'll speak of later on, this constitutes the forgiveness of venial sin. Article 2, whether the infusion of grace is necessary for the remission of venial sins. It would be necessary for the forgiveness of a mortal sin, since mortal sin leads to the loss of sanctifying grace. But to procure the forgiveness of venial sin, both acts of charity and infusions of grace are sufficient to cleanse a man from them. As St. Thomas puts it here, each thing is removed by its contrary. In order to remove venial sin, it is necessary to have a movement proceeding from grace, removing the inordinate attachment to the temporal thing. Article 3, whether venial sins are removed by the sprinkling of holy water and the like. No infusion of fresh grace is required for the forgiveness of a venial sin, but it is enough to have an act proceeding from grace and detestation of that venial sin, either explicit or at least implicit, as when one is moved fervently to God. Then, because these things include a movement of reverence for God and divine things, and in this way a bishop's blessing, the sprinkling of holy water, any sacramental anointing, a prayer said in a dedicated church, and anything else of this kind, conduce to the remission of venial sins. Article 4, whether venial sin can be taken away without mortal sin being taken away. And again, to simply quote our article, Aquinas says, although no new infusion of habitual grace is requisite for the remission of venial sin, yet it is necessary to exercise some act of grace which cannot be in one who is a subject of mortal sin. So an act of charity, which is a supernatural act of love for God and entails the habit of penance, this can take away venial sin. As St. Peter said, love covers a multitude of sins, but charity is a grace. It is an infused virtue which is lost along with sanctifying grace when a man steps into mortal sin. And so mortal sin must be forgiven. Grace must be infused again for then a man to act through grace in the forgiveness of venial sins. We move then on to question 88 of the return of sins which have been taken away by penance. Article 1, whether sins once forgiven return through a subsequent sin. As explained well, and in a brief word from our article, Aquinas says, the apostle says, Romans 11:29, the gifts and call of God are irrevocable. Now the penitent's sins are taken away by a gift of God. Therefore the sins which have been taken away do not return through a subsequent sin, as though God repented his gift of forgiveness. So subsequent sins can bring back to a man the punishment of eternal damnation which he had before when he was in a state of mortal sin. But once a sin is forgiven, it is forgiven. And when a man, Lord forbid, commits a new mortal sin, it is not as if these old sins were then no longer forgiven. It's just that punishment coming back to him, the punishment for any mortal sin, which is eternal damnation. Article 2, whether sins that have been forgiven return through ingratitude, which is shown especially in 4 kinds of sin. Beginning with St. Thomas, he says, sins pardoned through penance are said to return insofar as their debt of punishment. by reason of ingratitude is virtually contained in the subsequent sin. So a man can be ungrateful for the gift of forgiveness when he continues to sin against God, or when he decides not to forgive his brother, even though God forgave him, or by rejecting the faith and apostasy, since it was faith quickened by charity which gave forgiveness to him in the first place, or by refusing to make use of the sacrament of confession for the forgiveness of sins, especially mortal sins, since the sacrament is itself the gift of God, or through regret of having repented of one's past sins, which shows ingratitude to God, who got them out of these sins. Thus Aquinas concludes, accordingly, it is said that the ingratitude of sinners is a special cause of the return of sins previously forgiven. Article 3, whether the debt of punishment that arises through ingratitude in respect of a subsequent sin is as great as that of the sins previously pardoned. Does the ingratitude entailed in falling back into subsequent sin bring about a greater debt of punishment due because of the ingratitude than the original sin did? And this doesn't have to be the case. The debt of punishment for the new mortal sin, for the man who was a moment ago in a state of grace, forgiven of earlier mortal sins, the debt of punishment here is going to be determined by the species or the kind of the sin, along with the malice behind it, which is going to include the ingratitude towards God. Thus, putting together the motive, the act, and the ingratitude entailed in such an act, one will then arrive at the debt of punishment due for this particular sin, which can be greater for future sins than previous ones incurred, but not necessarily has to be greater. Article 4 in the last article, whether the ingratitude whereby a subsequent sin causes the return of previous sins is a special sin. And again, the species of a sin is drawn normally from the intention of the perpetrator, so that, as Aquinas says here, he who commits adultery in order to steal is a thief rather than an adulterer. If therefore a sinner commits a sin in contempt of God and of the favor received from him, then sin is drawn to the species of ingratitude. And in this way, a sinner's ingratitude is a special sin. But without this, then this new mortal sin would simply be of its own species or kind, not a unique sin of gratitude, and therefore its punishment is going to be in accord with its kind, the intention, the circumstance, and the kind. And with that, we close another episode. We have just finished covering questions 87 and 88 of the Tertia Pars, that is, of the remission of venial sin and of the return of sins which have been taken away by penance. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.